Did some Neanderthal populations evolve into Homo sapiens after all? The old theory that Neanderthals evolved directly into Cro Magnons was once dismissed as a relic of pre-genetic anthropology, a simplistic narrative swept aside by the rise of the out-of-Africa theory. That model, in its original form, argued for a recent African origin of modern humans, followed by a total annihilation of archaic populations across Eurasia. Neanderthals, in this view, were evolutionary dead ends, but genetics did not simply refine this picture. It destroyed it when interbreeding and hybridization were proven to have occurred. However, genetics has now refined this story even more and is telling us that some Neanderthal populations did not disappear, but instead transitioned gradually, slowly, into what we now recognize as early European modern humans. The critical shift begins with the realization that Neanderthals were not a single homogeneous population. The genomic evidence, particularly from the Altai region of Siberia, demonstrates that Neanderthal populations were deeply structured. The Altai Neanderthal from Siberia represents a lineage that diverged 250,000 years ago from the Neanderthal population that contributed DNA to modern humans. This is as deeply divergent as the Siberian Denisovans are from the Denisovans that interbred with Papuans. This is not a minor regional variation, it is a divergence on the scale of major evolutionary splits within the hominin clade. In practical terms, it means that by the time Homo sapiens encountered Neanderthals in the Middle East, those Neanderthals were already part of a distinct Western population, genetically separated from their Eastern relatives for hundreds of thousands of years. This alone undermines the idea of a single Neanderthal type, and instead reveals a network of populations, each with its own evolutionary trajectory. When we bring in the European Neanderthals, the picture becomes even more nuanced. The European Neanderthals are genetically closer to the Neanderthal DNA found in modern Eurasians than the Altai Neanderthal is, but they are not identical to the introgressing population either. Instead, they appear to sit between the Altai Neanderthals and the Neanderthals that actually interbred with Homo sapiens. This suggests ongoing gene flow across Eurasia. Eastern Neanderthals, like those in the Altai Mountains, occasionally contributed genes westward, while Western populations, especially those in the Middle East, maintained their own distinct identity, but were not completely isolated. The result is a gradient of Neanderthal diversity, stretching from Siberia to the Mediterranean, rather than a single expanding population. This is where the Shanidar Neanderthals become central. The specimens from Shanidar cave occupy precisely the geographic zone where Homo sapiens and Neanderthals are known to have overlapped repeatedly over tens of thousands of years. Unlike the Altai Neanderthals, which represent a long isolated eastern branch, and unlike the Western Neanderthals, which represent a later European population, the Shanidar Neanderthals sit at the crossroads of Africa, Europe and Asia. And crucially, they display anatomical features that have long been described as derived or even modern-like. Among these is the morphology of the mandible, particularly in the little-known Shanidar II, which shows a degree of chin development that approaches what we would consider early modern human. Shanidar II emerges from the Zagros Mountains of modern-day Persia not as a caricature of a primitive Neanderthal, but as a far more complex specimen whose anatomy and treatment in death begin to blur the very boundary that has long been drawn between Neanderthals and modern humans. He was an adult male, around 30 years old, with evidence of mild degenerative joint disease, subtle arthritis that speaks to a physically demanding life rather than pathological frailty, and when discovered he lay on his right side, partially preserved, partially lost to time and disturbance. His stature, estimated at approximately 5 feet 2 inches, places him slightly below the average height for Neanderthal males, but well within their known range, reinforcing the idea that he was not an outlier in terms of body size, but rather a typical member of his population in that respect. Despite this disturbance, the burial context itself is difficult to dismiss as purely accidental or natural. Shanidar II appears to have been deliberately placed, and the evidence surrounding the body suggests a form of intentional funerary behavior. A small concentration of stones was found directly over the burial, along with worked lithic points fashioned from chert, implying that objects of technological value were associated with the interment. Even more striking is the evidence of a substantial fire in close proximity to the grave, a feature that has been interpreted as part of a ritualized send-off rather than a sluchai incidental occurrence. It is, however, the cranial morphology that pushes this specimen into far more provocative territory. Shanidar too has been described as possessing a relatively high cranial vault, departing from the more elongated, low-profile vault typically associated with classic European Neanderthals. Even more significant is the presence of a pronounced chin region, subtle perhaps by modern human standards, but nonetheless more developed than what is traditionally expected in Neanderthal mandibles, which are usually characterized by a receding chin. When combined with other proportional aspects of the skull, these features create a mosaic anatomy that does not fit neatly into the standard Neanderthal template. Instead, Shanidar too appears to occupy an intermediate morphological space, one that overlaps with traits commonly attributed to anatomically modern humans. This is not a trivial observation, nor can it be dismissed as mere individual variation without consequence. When a population repeatedly exhibits traits that trend toward what we classify as modern, the question shifts from anomaly to pattern. The Shanidar Neanderthals, situated geographically in the Middle East, a well-documented zone of repeated contact between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, represents precisely such a pattern. Rather than being a static, isolated group, they appear to have been part of a dynamic population network in which gene flow, environmental pressures, and cultural interactions could all contribute to morphological variability. In this context, the features observed in Shanidar II are not just anatomical curiosities, they are signals of a broader evolutionary process. If we integrate this anatomical evidence with the genetic data, a compelling hypothesis emerges. The Neanderthal population that contributed DNA to modern humans was not the Altai Neanderthal and not identical to the European Neanderthals, but rather a Middle Eastern group, represented by men such as those from Shanidar, that had already begun to exhibit a mixture of archaic and derived traits. These populations were not static. They existed in a region that was repeatedly occupied by Homo sapiens during favorable climatic windows, particularly during interglacial periods such as marine isotope stage 5. Each of these episodes created opportunities for contact, gene flow, and cultural exchange. Over time, this process could produce a gradual blending rather than a sharp replacement. Instead of imagining a single wave of Homo sapiens sweeping through and replacing Neanderthals, we can envision a prolonged zone of interaction stretching across the Levant and adjacent regions. In this zone, Neanderthal populations like those at Shanidar would have interbred with incoming Homo sapiens groups, incorporating new genetic variants while retaining much of their existing morphology and cultural traditions. The result would not be a sudden transformation, but a slow shift, a population that becomes increasingly modern over time while still rooted in its Neanderthal ancestry. This framework also helps explain the intermediate position of European Neanderthals, such as those from France. If gene flow was occurring across Eurasia, then Western Neanderthals would have received genetic input both from the Middle Eastern populations interacting with Homo sapiens and from more distant groups like the Altai Neanderthals. This would place them genetically between these extremes exactly as observed. The approximate 125,000-year divergence between European Neanderthals and the Altai Neanderthals can be understood not as a simple split, but as the result of ongoing gene flow smoothing out differences between populations that were never completely isolated. What emerges from this is not a tree, but a network. The Neanderthal world was composed of multiple populations, each diverging and reconnecting over time. The Altai Neanderthals represent one extreme of this network, deeply isolated, genetically distinct, and only occasionally interacting with other groups. The European Neanderthals represent a more connected population, influenced by both Eastern and Southern gene flow. And the Shanidar Neanderthals represent the critical interface with Homo sapiens, a population that was in the process of transforming into something new. This has profound implications for the origins of Europeans. If the Middle Eastern Neanderthals were already integrating Homo sapiens genes and traits over a long period, then the populations that later expanded into Europe during the Upper Paleolithic would not have been purely Homo sapiens at all. Instead, they could represent a hybrid population, one that emerged in the Middle East through prolonged interaction between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. In this scenario, Europeans are not simply descendants of a recent migration with a small amount of Neanderthal admixture. They are, in part, the descendants of a Neanderthal population that was transformed through interbreeding and cultural exchange. This fundamentally alters the dynamics of how that species spread and diversified. The out-of-Africa model relies on a near-total replacement component. Homo sapiens expands into Eurasia, from refugia in the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean coast of Africa and the Levant, and replaces Neanderthal populations. The genetic evidence of Neanderthal introgression already forced a weakening of that model, introducing the idea of limited admixture. But the deep structure of Neanderthal populations, combined with the anatomical evidence from Shanidar cave, suggests that the process was far more complex. Rather than replacement with minor admixture, we are looking at regional integration, populations merging, evolving together, and giving rise to new forms. The Altai-Neanderthal divergence is key to this reinterpretation. A 250,000-year split means that by the time Homo sapiens entered Eurasia, Neanderthals had already been evolving along multiple independent trajectories. The population that Homo sapiens encountered in the Middle East was not representative of all Neanderthals, but a specific branch, one that was particularly well positioned for interaction due to its geographic location and ecological context. This branch, represented by Shanidar, shows signs of morphological flexibility and possible adaptation to a wider range of environments, including those shared with Homo sapiens. When we consider the long-term consequences of this interaction, the idea that Neanderthals evolved into Europeans begins to look less like a discarded myth and more like a reframed hypothesis. Not in the sense of a direct, linear transformation, but as part of a complex process of hybridization and regional continuity. The Neanderthals did not simply vanish. In some regions, they became something else. They merged with Homo sapiens populations, contributed not only genes, but also anatomical traits and cultural practices, and helped shape the populations that would later dominate Europe. This perspective also aligns with the broader pattern seen in human evolution, where boundaries between species are often porous and change occurs through interaction rather than isolation. The rigid classifications of the past, Neanderthal versus Homo sapiens, begin to dissolve when viewed through the lens of genetics and population dynamics. What we see instead is a continuum, a shifting mosaic of populations that cannot be easily separated into discrete categories. In this light, the Shanidar Neanderthals are not just another regional variant, they are a critical piece of the puzzle. Their morphology hints at a population in transition, their location places them at the center of interaction, and their genetic relationship to the introgressing Neanderthals connects them directly to modern humans. When combined with the deep divergence of the Altai Neanderthals and the intermediate position of the European Neanderthals, they form a coherent picture. A structured Neanderthal world in which different populations play different roles in the emergence of modern Eurasians. The old narrative of replacement is no longer sufficient. The evidence points toward a more intricate process, one in which Neanderthals were not merely replaced by Homo sapiens, but were, in some regions, transformed through sustained interaction. Europeans in this framework are not simply the descendants of Homo sapiens with a trace of Neanderthal DNA. They are the product of a long and complex history of interbreeding, regional evolution, and population dynamics that blur the line between archaic and modern. Thanks for watching and subscribing.